Thinking back to our class period on Tuesday, we finished up talking about the eye and the structures associated with it and that obvious sense of vision. What we're going to do now is talk about your ears, which we all know, we learn as little kids that our ears are the structures that allow us to hear. So our ears are very involved with hearing or audition, which is the fancier term for hearing. But your ears are also home to the structures associated with the sense of equilibrium. Equilibrium is just a fancier word for balance. And I would say of all the five special senses, that's the one we take for granted the most. We really don't, I think, appreciate how amazing being able to do the complicated, stuff that we do. Something as simple as walking can be very difficult if you are experiencing vertigo, where you're losing your balance. Just getting up and doing the normal activities of daily living become very challenging if you're feeling dizzy, lightheaded, that kind of stuff, and can be very detrimental to your health and your mental health as well if you're struggling to stay in balance and whatnot. So we'll talk a little bit more about the structures associated with that on the next slide. Because on this slide, we're going to focus in on the outer and the middle parts of the ear. There's actually three different distinctive parts to your ears. The external or outer ear, which is what we would generally think of as our ear. And that includes not only this big structure called the auricle, but also the external auditory canal, which takes that sound waves that are created when we, hear noises. And those sound waves created by noises, whether that's from me speaking or just noises from the world, those structures channel that into what we would call the middle ear, where we find the three auditory ossicles, which we've talked about before. And then the structures of the inner ear shown right here. We'll talk about those on the next page. I just didn't have enough room, and that's okay. We'll see them again or talk about them on the next page. So once again, external ear collects sound wave channels inward. Middle ear conveys the sound vibrations to what's called the oval window. And then the internal ear houses the receptors for hearing, but also the receptors for equilibrium. Okay. So once again, fancy term for your, what we generally call our ear is your auricle. Also goes by the term pinna. It's the visible portion of your ear supported by elastic cartilage. Consists of two major kind of parts, the helix and the lobule. And now there's other parts, like there's like the little rims and whatnot, little pieces that you can look at. They're commonly pierced, but I'm not going to really get into any of those. The helix and the lobule is all you need to know. The helix is the rim of your auricle. The lobule is what we just would commonly call our earlobe. There are various ligaments and muscles attaching our auricle to our head. So in other words, keeping your ears from falling off. External auditory canal. If you replace the word auditory, you can use the word acoustic. Okay, there's a 2.5 centimeter or 1 inch tube leading from the auricle into the temporal bone, ending at the tympanic membrane, which is the fancy term for your eardrum. Okay, and that's kind of the barrier between your outer ear and your middle ear. Okay. We've talked about this area of the body before, back when we talked about the temporal bone, but also back when we introduced ceruminous glands, which we learned are just a fancy term to describe our earwax glands. They secrete cerumen or earwax here, which we can see illustrated in the picture. Okay. A little bit more about the tympanic membrane. Once again, that's your eardrum, a thin, semi-transparent membrane or partition between the external auditory canal and the middle ear, covered on the outside by the epidermis. So it's just like our skin on the outside, and then lining it is simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay. Between those layers is connective tissue with collagen, elastic fibers, and fibroblasts. Okay, so those are the structures of the outer or external ear. Okay, your middle ear also goes by the term tympanic cavity, a small air-filled cavity in the petrous portion of the temporal bone, about 2 to 3 millimeters wide. So it's really, really thin and not very big space. lies between the eardrum and the oval and round windows, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Consists of connective tissue between the layers of the epithelium. Okay. Once again, we've talked about these before, and actually we've seen this image previously back when we talked about the bones of the body. The malleus is the first. It's attached to the backside of your eardrum. Also goes by the hammer. When the eardrum rattles or vibrates due to the sound vibrations, the malleus also vibrates. Okay, and then it channels that vibration to the next structure, what we call the incus or anvil, which is attached to the back of the malleus, and then attached to the back of the incus is the stapes or stirrup. And then basically what happens is all three of those end up vibrating, and then that vibration is transferred to an opening in their structure, the opening to what's called the cochlea, which is this thing that looks like a snail shell. And that opening is called the oval window, which is one of the two windows that I'm going to talk about, the other being the round window. But I'll get to that here in a second. Now, if we were to zoom in at this area in the picture, which there's one of those in your textbook, I didn't include it here, and that's okay. What you would find are a couple very small muscles that limit the motion of the eardrum and limit damage from prolonged loud noises. Unfortunately, they're not as effective against sudden sharp noises. So something really loud and really quick, like a gunshot, or like when you hear somebody slapping or something like that. The muscles include the tensor tympani muscle attached to the malleus, helps to increase tension on the eardrum, and then the stapedius muscle, which attaches to the stapes and limits its motion. It actually is the smallest muscle in your body. So in other words, they prevent too much vibration and too much energy being transferred to your inner ear. Once again, that's effective when it's something prolonged, like over a long period of time, but just not as effective against something that is really quick and sharp. Okay. Openings to the middle ear include that opening from the external auditory meatus covered by the tympanic membrane that we've talked about. So it would be this opening right here, which is truly not an opening because it's covered by that tympanic membrane. The oval window also goes by the term vestibular window, opens into the inner ear where the stapes fits. The other window is called the round window, another opening to the inner ear, goes by the term cochlear window. It is covered by what we would call the secondary tympanic membrane, which is kind of like the much smaller secondary eardrum. Okay. And then there's this tube here, which is called the auditory tube, also goes by pharyngotympanic tube or eustachian tube. It connects the middle ear with the nasopharynx to equalize pressure in your middle ear. Okay. Normally this tube is closed and only opens when you swallow and when you yawn. And this explains why, if you plug your nose and you blow, what happens to your ears? They pop. Okay, that pressure builds up, pushing out on the eardrum. Okay. Now, thinking about like little kids, it's very common to get middle ear infections, and it's because of this tube. And it's just because of the size of their skull is really small, and since it's connected to the nasopharynx, it's not connected directly to the nose, but the nasopharynx is the portion of our throat just behind our throat. And when kids get sick, they produce a lot more mucus, just like what happens when we get older. And I'm currently experiencing that myself. But since this tube is really short, it's easy for some of that mucus to get into this area, and that's what can lead to those, inner ear, middle ear type infections that little kids have. One of the common things that a kid has put in when they have those types of situations is what? Tubes. Okay. Those tubes that kids have surgically implanted are just tiny little tubes that go through this tympanic membrane and therefore allow the drainage to occur. So it's kind of a cool process that doctors have come up with to alleviate that. And over time, those tubes just kind of fall out, and then the eardrum repairs itself. And that's fairly common because eardrums do get damaged from time to time. You can perforate them, especially if you like to stick a Q-tip too far in there, which can be very dangerous. Okay, I'm going to tell you right now, just like I told you the other day when I told you this image would be on the exam. If I didn't tell you that, I'm telling you now. This image will also be on the exam. I'll tell you that right now. Okay. Now, as far as what you need to know, it's probably just going to be easier if I tell you what you can just kind of cross off and not have to worry about. And So I'll just kind of go around clockwise. Once again, these are the things I would say don't worry about. The temporal bone, internal auditory canal. Don't worry, where it says two nasopharynx, that's not that big a deal. Don't worry about cerumen, and don't worry about elastic cartilage. So those are things you don't need to worry about. Make sure you know, like where it says, the stapes, make sure you also know oval window. Same thing here, round window, make sure you know that's also where the secondary tympanic membrane is. I also would like for you to draw in an arrow and point to right here where the cursor is and label that what we call the vestibule. That general area called the vestibule, I don't know why it's not labeled, is an important structure that we'll talk about now. Okay, your internal ear, inner ear also goes by the term labyrinth because it is a complicated series of canals. The word labyrinth means like maze. There was a movie once upon a time, I think it was like late 80s, early 90s, called Labyrinth. It's really weird. It's a Jim Henson, so there's like Muppets in it. David Bowie. It's really weird though. I think you pretty much have to be on drugs to really understand it, considering it's a kid's movie. But anyway, it's all about a maze. And that's what your labyrinth term is referring to. Okay. Structurally, the inner ear consists of two parts: the outer bony labyrinth and then the inner membranous labyrinth. Okay. And if we look down here at the bottom, we are basically zooming in on the three main structures that are part of the bony labyrinth, what we call the three semicircular canals, which are these kind of loops right there. Then you got the cochlea that I mentioned on the previous page that looks like a snail shell. And then kind of in between what I had you label on that previous page is the vestibule. Okay, let's start by talking about the vestibule. It contains receptors for maintaining equilibrium or balance and is the oval central portion of the bony labyrinth. Okay, the cochlea is a coiled tube, arises from the anterior side of the vestibule. And this organ contains receptor cells that respond to vibrations created by sound waves. So in other words, this is the structure that helps you hear the noises that are created and that result in sound waves. You may have heard of somebody having like a cochlear implant put in, which is a device that helps people that are suffering from hearing loss. Okay, and it's called a cochlear implant because it functions as like essentially a mechanical cochlea. Okay. So in other words, your cochlea, it contains receptors for hearing. It is a structure that has three fluid-filled chambers, and you can see those are labeled here where they've opened it up. The scala tympani, cochlear duct, and the scala vestibuli are those names. Superior chamber is the vestibuli, ends at the oval window. Inferior chamber is the tympani, which ends at the round window. And we just talked about those two openings just a second ago. Middle ear is the more important of the three. Because it is where the organ of Corti is. The organ of Corti or spiral organ is the transducer. This is a fancy word for a structure that converts. So it converts vibrations into nerve impulses. Okay. So in other words, this is how we take sound waves and end up making action potentials out of them. Okay. The cells that actually do this are called hair cells, and they have little tiny extensions called microvilli or stereocilia that are able to bend and act as the receptors for vibrations. Okay, there's also supporting cells which support, and I'm really not going to get into those too much. It's very similar to what we saw the other day when we talked about the supporting cells and the receptor cells in our nose and our taste buds. We've got actual cells doing the generation and response of action potentials, and then supporting cells that just kind of help keep things going. Okay, so that's the cochlea. Okay, the final structure of the bony labyrinth is the three semicircular canals. They're full of a fluid called perilymph, which is a little bit different than the fluid that's in the cochlear duct called the endolymph. Okay, but there's three of these semicircular canals, and they're named based on their positions. So there's an anterior, there's a posterior, and a lateral. Although, looking at the previous page, only one of them is labeled, and the three aren't actually labeled as far as which one's anterior, which one's posterior, and which one's lateral, and that's okay. I'm not that concerned about it. Okay. At the bottom of those three semicircular canals are going to be where you find an enlargement called an ampulla. And you can see that structure there. Okay. This is going to be where you find the receptors that are responsible for equilibrium. So in other words, equilibrium or balance is going to involve the vestibule and the semicircular canals, whereas hearing is strictly associated with the cochlea. Okay. Now those are all structures, once again, of the bony labyrinth. The inner parts of these structures is what we call the membranous labyrinth, and it contains a fluid, once again, the same one that we just talked about, called endolymph, and then two sacs, what we call the utricle, and then the saccule, and those are very involved with equilibrium, okay, as well. Structurally, your inner ear is innervated by two different branches of one big cranial nerve. If you think back to our last unit, we learned that cranial nerve number 8, cranial nerves, because there's two of them, one for each ear. Cranial nerves number 8 are known as the vestibular cochlear nerves. And if I go back to the previous page, you can see the vestibular cochlear nerve forks before connecting to these structures. This structure here, what we call the vestibular branch, attaches to the vestibule, hence the name vestibular. Cochlear branch, hopefully is common sense, connects to the cochlea. Okay, and that's a couple things that you had to label or highlight on the previous page. As far as this image goes, I'm not worried about you knowing it. Even though the things I just talked about are visible, it's really too kind of complicated to really get too worried about. So just make sure you know this one, because like I said, you will see it next week. All right, any questions?